Good morning, students. This is your Lesson 3 lecture for CIS279AD, working with Active Directory sites. So as we know, the essential portion of Active Directory is dealing with the logical, whereas sites are dealing with the physical. So this is that idea that although we may have a single unified domain, we need to somehow route traffic, for example, Active Directory updates, between two physical sites. So to do that, we're going to create sites in Active Directory and have domain controllers at each site. So let's take a look. So essentially today we're going to introduce Active Directory sites and how to configure Active Directory replication. Your lab that you're going to complete does a really good job of this using two servers that I'll show you. So logical versus physical, by now you should have a very good understanding of the ability to see the forest through the trees. So we have that forest, which of course when we create an initial domain, our very first domain controller, we're also creating the forest. Inside that forest we have trees, to domains, subdomains, etc. Then the domains, organizational units for organizing the units and objects within Active Directory, and finally those link objects. So when we talk about the physical infrastructure, this is where we're talking about IP subnets and sites and the domain controllers that exist inside those physical sites or locations. So, sites are defined as IP subnets that are well connected. So this is where your CCNA stuff is going to come into play, which means that network infrastructure between them is fast and reliable. So that we can, again, transfer information between two physical locations. So in most cases, Active Directory site will map to a single LAN. Multiple sites will be joined together by site links. So we're going to have to create sites as well as links to those sites, connecting those sites. So what's a site? When clients log into Active Directory, they use DNS, as we know, to query Active Directory topology to locate, for example, the first thing, the closest available domain controller, to offer network resources, authentication, etc. They use site topology to establish replication partners that provide efficiency and keep Active Directory database consistent. We certainly realize that if it's one database we want to know is always up to date, it is that Active Directory. So consequently, anytime we do create our first domain in a forest, etc., we're also developing or creating our default first site. I want to take a look at that, so I've opened up your lab here. I've got the RWDC and RWDC2. As you can see, here they are. They're in that first site. The default first site is automatically created. One thing I want to suggest is a lot of IT professionals will go ahead and rename this to something like HQ site or headquarters site. Again, there's an example. I wanted to make it more clear than that. The process of duplicating Active Directory information between domain controllers for the purpose of fault tolerance and redundancy. So of course, as we've discussed, in a domain we want to make sure we have multiple domain controllers. In case we lose one of our domain controllers, we have the ability to continue with Active Directory, continue authentication, as well as delivering users access to resources and what resources are available to them. So based on the multi-master replication, in which domain controllers for each domain participate in the replication process. This is stuff we have already introduced. So when we talk about Active Directory replication, there's two types: intra-site and inter-site. Intranet, internet, those kind of things. Same kind of idea. So intra-site replication transmits changes in the Active Directory, almost as soon as they occur. So this is happening inside a single site. For example, the default first site, we have multiple domain controllers. They're going to replicate as soon as a change is made. Now, the issue becomes when we talk about replicating amongst sites or inter-site replication, we could end up with a ton of replication traffic. So instead of allowing that to be sort of a real-time synchronous, it's somewhat asynchronous in that we're going to go ahead and allow this to happen on a scheduled basis. So we can schedule when it's going to happen between physical sites. Just like we schedule when users can log in and log off, we can create a very detailed schedule as to when inter-site replication will take place. Inter-site replication is compressed. This way, fewer bits and bytes are transferring over that physical connection. So intra we went over, inter, there we are, means external. So here's an example of, we've got domain A here, we've got domain B. Now if you notice, not all of the domain controllers within a domain or in a site are going to communicate. What we end up with are a primary server that gets the role of bridge server. So what would happen in a site replication here, say this was in Bend, this was in Texas, is these bridge servers would do the inter-site replication. Once they received the items that needed to be replicated, it would then continue with an intra-site replication so that all the domain controllers had updated Active Directory databases. So replication process, basically when does it replicate? When an object is added or removed from Active Directory, when the value of an attribute is changed, we'll talk more about that, and the name of an object has changed. So that's when we're going to get a replication. Now, how replication works is that objects are given this idea of an update sequence number. Keeps track of the changes that are made to each DC, and thus keeps track of which updates should be replicated to other domain controllers. A version ID is assigned to an attribute so that we can then, once we know, okay, there's an update sequence number that this domain controller doesn't have, we need to update, but what version is it on? We can get the latest version. So this of course comes from, say, engineering change on a drawing. We would keep version numbers so we know which one is the most recent. In a large Active Directory database, though, this may not be enough. We then of course add a timestamp so we ensure that if two domain controllers in different sites were making a change, and perhaps the update sequence number said, okay, they're both the same, which one do we take? We then go down to the timestamp, which one was made last. So of course the idea behind this is we're not always transferring or querying the database. We are sending out those sequence numbers to say, hey, do you have this sequence number? No. Okay, here's an object that we need to go ahead and synchronize between sites. Again, we talked about a bridgehead server, and a bridgehead server is that primary server that connects sites. It's going to get the replication items and then do an intra-site replication amongst its domain controllers within its domain, within its site. The whole process, of course, of updating goes all the way down to at what point or how long does it take for this process to take place so that all domain controllers in an environment contain the most updated or up-to-date information. And once that happens, we consider the Active Directory to be converged or convergence. So again, another quick example. Convergence would take place only after this domain controller, which has an update, would update with this one here, the bridge servers, and both domain controllers would update all the domain controllers within their Active Directory site. So of course we're familiar with KCCs, or knowledge consistency checkers. Each domain controller uses the internal process called KCC to map the logical network topology between the domain controllers. Each domain controller in the site, the KCC will select one or more replication partners. The replication takes place, and we do a check to make sure that everything is replicated accordingly. So viewing the Active Directory connection objects, we can do that by opening the Active Directory Sites and Servers snap-in, clicking the Sites folder, select the desired sites, expand the server name for which, and then right-click the NTDs settings. So let's take a quick look. I've gone into the RWDC01. I've opened up Active Directory Sites and Services. Here's the sites. We then would select the desired site. In this case, I only have the default site. I'm going to expand the servers. Since we're on DC1, we'll look at DC1. Here's the NTDs settings. We can right-click and go to Properties. Okay, we can include a description if we want. We can see that this is the global catalog. Here are the connections. So in this case, we're going to replicate from to, and replicate to. So in this case, we only have 2 domain controllers, RWDC01, which we're looking at, and its connections are to both to replicate from and replicate to. Here's the object information and where we would find that object. And of course, one of the good things is we can go ahead and click this button to protect the object from accidental deletion. It's just another step. As we know, objects are way too easy to be deleted in Active Directory, especially users, the whole right-click delete, and we've talked about why we don't want to do that. Security, so who has what rights. Authenticated users, of course, can read, all the way down to domain users, which are going to have essentially the full control. And then the attribute editor if we wanted to edit attributes or see attributes. Remember, sometimes with the attribute editor, it's good to come in here if you're going to run a command line for things, and you can see, what the CN is, what the schema is, etc. So it can actually help you a bit. I found it useful to run commands. So with that done, let's go ahead and we'll continue and move on. Here's their example of the NTDs settings and seeing those, the connections, etc. So in this case, we can see that this has multiple connections to multiple sites. So creating a new site in Active Directory, we would right-click the Sites folder, go to New Site. In the Object Site dialog box, key the name that you want for the site, select the default IP site link from the list, and continue on. So in your lab, you're going to be doing this. I'm not going to show you much about this. Of course, once we create a site, we need to create that subnet, that physical connection, so we would do that as well. And I'll give you a second to look through this. So creating a new subnet. Now remember, in this case, we're going to use the short code. So in this case, what they've done is created a new subnet at 192.168.52.0 on a WAC 24 class C 255.255.255 subnet. So, and then again, the object link is going to be to the default. The cost essentially, allows the administrator to define the path of replication will take. If there's more than one path that can be used to replicate, so of course, the lower number cost will be chosen over a higher number. So basically, cost actually in the olden days came from cost. Which connection cost us more to use, essentially. But we would have a priority. Which may tend to be the cheaper versus, say, a lease line or a backup line that we're paying for only when we're using it, only when data is transferring over it, etc. So, cost values 1 to 99,999. Again, chosen by the Active Directory administrator. So we're going to define that. And as I mentioned previously, we can then go in when we're talking about inter-site replication between two sites. If we have that physical WAN connection per se, we may want to limit the traffic on there, i.e. limit Active Directory replication amongst sites during business hours per se. So maybe we change that from 15-minute default to 180 minutes. And then maybe even longer, depending on how much traffic is flowing over that connection during the day. And of course, how many Active Directory changes we're making daily. If these are pretty static Active Directory domains, maybe we only want to make those changes, in the evenings. So that's something to think about. Bandwidth is an issue. So default replication frequency for a new site link is 180 minutes, but it can be configured to take place as frequently as every 15 minutes and as infrequently as once per week. So again, if we have a location where people don't change, resources don't change, permissions don't change all that much, maybe we limit that replication. But also remember that by limiting that replication, we may want to do something like go in and force a replication right after we make a change and make that part of our business process. So Replication Protocol is RPC, Remote Procedure Calls over Internet Protocols. So we have the RPC protocol that's going to be routed over IP. That's the standard for replication. Another replication protocol is SMTP, Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. The idea here is that we don't have this reliable, constant connection. We need to figure out another way to replicate, and we do this through SMTP. It's asynchronous communication, of course, meaning that each replication does not need to complete before the other. SMTP can replicate domain directory, cannot replicate domain directory permissions. SMTP was really used when we had ye olde idea of ye olde dial-up and very unreliable connections, whereas today it is so cheap to get a WAN link between two locations and utilize the internet in which to do that. So unlike RPC over IP, SMTP does not adhere to schedules. It should be used only when replicating between different domains over an extremely slow or unreliable WAN link. So again, the cost these days to get a reliable WAN link is really cost effective when we talk about the configuration and constant management of SMTP. Again, creating a new site link, we'll go into Active Directory Services, we'll expand the intra-site transports folder and go through. So this slide here, slide 30, is one that you might want to consider printing, as it gives a summary of replication methods. I'm not going to go through this, but down here the KCC checks topology changes every 15 minutes. The default replication, for inter sites 180, 7 days a week, etc. One thing I do want to mention, I'm going to go back here, is sometimes, especially on weekends when you're running that full backup and maybe you're using that WAN link to back things up from your other sites, to your primary headquarters, you notice this is 7 days a week. Unless you're making changes on the weekend, go ahead and take that off of the schedule. That way you free up that bandwidth on the weekend for things like backups, updates, transports, etc. So refreshing the intrastate replication topology. So if we want to see what it looks like, we can go ahead and do that. In Active Directory Sites, expand the sites, followed by the site where you wish to run the KCC, expand the servers, double-click one of the domain controllers. In the Details pane, we're going to right-click the NTDs Settings. This is right where we were before. Click All Tasks and select Replication. So going back to our quick example, here we're in Sites, we've selected a server, we're down to NTDs Settings, we're going to right-click, go to All Tasks, and check Replication Topology. It'll go out and check it, check the replication topology. We'll need to refresh the sites container, blah, blah, blah. We can go in and do all that and see the replication take place. So let's quickly take a look at finding which server has the intrastate topology generator role. So here I am again in Active Directory Sites and Services. I'm going to expand the sites. I'm going to expand the default first site into the Details pane. Here's my NTDs site settings. Right click, go to Properties, and we can see that the ISTC generator is on RWDC01. So let's continue on with the presentation here. So determine which server holds that role. You can force the KCC to regenerate the intersite topology. So if things have changed within the topology, like you put up a new site, we can force that quickly. We're not going to necessarily have to wait the time to look at it. You can force manual replication, so in Active Directory, expand the sites, followed by the site that contains the connection for which you want to force that replication. Locate the server, click the NTDs Settings where we were, and in the Details pane, right-click the connection for which you want replication to occur, and then we just say Replicate Now. So again, if it's in an in-trust site, that replication is going to happen almost immediately, but inter-site, the default 180 minutes, we don't want to have to wait. Let's go ahead and replicate. So monitoring tools for replication, DC-Diag and RepAdmin, and you're going to be using these in your lab. So essentially DC-Diag, it's a command line tool, as is RepAdmin. Perform connectivity and replication tests, reporting errors if there are any. Are there any DNS registration problems? Registering in DNS when we created the site, analyze permissions required for replication, analyze the state of the domain controllers within the forest. And then finally, RepAdmin, manually create that replication topology of a site. So command line to do this, to replicate the admin. So that's it. And I will see you all very soon. Enjoy your holiday.